Hey, this is Vu, and today I'm going to be taking a look at second round buys and whether you want rifles or SMGs. And this is something I think a lot of people have trouble with because they either have too many rifles, too many SMGs, or they simply don't know the situations in which to use either of these guns.
Tired of bad odds, poor markets, and problems with drawing your winnings? We've got great news. A new esports bookmaker, Cyber.bet. Register right now, make a deposit, and receive $10. Follow the link in the description and hurry up to pick your $10. Cyber.bet is your new esports bookmaker.
Now to get into it, the first thing I'm going to start here with is the CT side second round anti-eco. I will go into force buys a little bit, but this is the most simple place to start. When it comes to SMGs, you have four normal options. You have the MP9, the UMP, and the MP5, and of course the MP7 as well, and definitely not the pp-bizon because it is garbage. Now, the MP5 and MP7 have kind of been getting phased out recently because they don't have a real specialty. Both of these guns are strong in the majority of situations. They have a little bit of range for themselves, and they also have a little bit of spray power, the SMG kind of classic SMG thought, where you kind of spam around a corner and you try and spray people down, especially with pre-fires. The MP5 and MP7 have strengths in both, which make them great for rotator positions. For example, if you're playing mid-doors here, you might have to play a little bit from range, but you also might have to end up in a pretty long range spot as well, or you'll end up in a very close range spot. So mid-doors is a great example of a spot where players would often be looking at an SMG. You play pretty close up as you're actually playing the mid-doors, but you'll oftentimes end up rotating over to the B or A side where you may end up fighting at long range. Now the problem is, again, this gun does not have any real specialty, which means when you're fighting against the classic or the new school force buy that terrorists are often going for now, which is the heavy Krieg buy-up, you're going to find that you have a lot of trouble. You're kind of baited into going and fighting from a little bit of range. However, when you fight against the new school buy-up with the 3 Kriegs and a couple of pistols, those Kriegs are going to absolutely demolish you if you ever really try and fight them from range, and you're not specialized enough to be close range and really try and take them down either. So it feels a little bit wonky, especially if you're fighting against very experienced and high-level players. Now the UMP has the similar problem, except again it's trying to fight from long range, and this is where it really wants to be fighting. But again, if you're fighting against a Krieg with head armor, which you will very often find if you're playing against, again, coordinated players, you're going to be at a major disadvantage, and it's going to feel like you just get destroyed. So a lot of the time now, teams are opting very heavily into the MP9 buy-up because the MP9 is honestly borderline overpowered from the way I've seen it used. A lot of people are using it in awkward situations where a gun like the MP9 shouldn't probably be used unless it may be a little bit too powerful. But it has strengths in that it is, of course, fantastic against pistols. It can get multi-man spray downs, but it has low armor penetration. The thing is, even with low armor penetration, if you use it as it's meant to be used in the classic SMG style, where you're basically spraying around corners a lot of the time, spraying people down and pre-firing them, you can certainly take down Kriegs. You just want to be optimizing and utilizing yourself into very close range situations, especially ones where you can kind of hear people coming, maybe get a flash, and you can start to mow them down with these close range angles. This can be a little bit awkward if you play certain positions, though, again, like mid doors, because you end up close range right around mid doors. But if they go to the A side, what's going to happen? Well, you're pretty far away from your opponents, right? There's no real way to utilize yourself close range if you're rotating over to the A side. So Dust 2 is a little bit of a wonky map in this regard, and that's why you'll see oftentimes people look for quite a few rifles if they can. The standard buy-up that I've noticed recently is one of two things. Some teams like to go for the 5 MP9 buy-up, and some teams prefer to go for as many rifles as possible with players that can get a rifle and head armor and a little bit of utility, and the rest of the team go for MP9s, which usually means 3 MP9s and 2 M4s. And the reason you want that is you essentially just don't want guns that can be absolutely bullied by that inevitable Krieg buy-up that, you might not see all that time in matchmaking, but you will see occasionally. You just don't want your guns to be bullied, so you have the MP9s that can play close range against the Kriegs, and you have the M4s, which of course can play long range, and you try and make sure that you don't go too heavily into the rifle buy-up because you want those M4s to be recycled if something goes wrong, which often means you'll play them from range, but if you can, you'll often play them with an MP9 close together. So you'll play something like an M4 on the corner here with an MP9 close up, and that means if the M4 player dies, the gun will not be easily retrievable, and the MP9 player can eventually go back and get it. Of course, another good example would be like an M4 up here on catwalk on the ledge, and an MP9 very close up at this angle here. Again, you're giving an ability for the MP9 player to pick up the M4 and upgrade if the M4 player dies, and you're making it hard for them to take the kill down on the M4 and pick it up and actually use it themselves. On the T side second round, of course, you have the same SMG options, except the MP9 is replaced by the MAC-10. Now, the MAC-10 is generally thought of as a much weaker gun for real gun rounds compared to the MP9. It has less ability to actually deal with rifles, but on the second round, it is certainly a go-to buy-up, and it's something that I personally really like. You will see some teams and players opt into the MP5 or the MP7, mouse sports being one of them. However, I think the majority of teams look very heavily now towards rifles and MAC-10s and maybe the occasional UMP or MP5, maybe one on the round, not much more than that, because the rifles can create space for the MAC-10s to get up close and personal and start to mow people down. And again, when you have this spread where you have, maybe 2 AKs, a Galil, and 2 MAC-10s, you end up with a situation where the MAC-10s can begin to farm, especially if your opponents are going for a no armor eco, like some teams like to do. The MAC-10s can get up close and farm that $600 per kill. However, if something goes wrong and your riflers start to be picked off, your MAC-10 players can go back, pick up the AKs or the SGs, and give themselves a better weapon into the following round. So this is the type of balance that you really want to be looking at. I mentioned it on the CT side. It is even more true on the T side. And the reason for that is you can pick your engagements on the T side a little bit more than you can on the CT side, in that you know exactly where you're going, and you can have those rifles create space for the MAC-10s to close the distance and force those close range engagements. And because you can force those engagements the way you want, you're not too worried about rotating around to an area that you were not intending to go. You can certainly look at utilizing your weapons more specifically and worry a little bit less about the all-around utility of the weapon. Whereas on CT side, again, you're oftentimes in a situation where you're playing alone or with one teammate and you need your weapon to be able to do a little bit more. On the T side, again, 3 rifles is what we're looking at if you have the money for it, and oftentimes you're looking at more than just $3,700 to buy AK and armor. You're looking at something like $4K if you can to buy AK armor and at least a little bit of utility, because utility is the only other thing you can use to really deny space from your opponents and force players out when they have things like scouts. But I think the CT side second round force buy is a little bit less feared than the T side second round force buy nowadays, and teams are having a very good time dealing with it simply by, again, utilizing these weapons correctly. Make sure you're not just running in the open with your MAC-10 and running like a chicken with its head cut off. You want to make sure that you're utilizing the MAC-10 in tandem with those players that have the longer ranged and more powerful long range weapons. Now, if we're looking at second round force buys, this is where things start to get a little bit wonky. It really depends on the T side specifically if you get a bomb plan. And I don't want to go over all the sorts of possibilities, but I will recommend that if you get a bomb plan and you are playing with a coordinated squad who are willing to drop guns to each other, that you should go for this ridiculous commonplace force buy that people are seeing now if you have the money. And that means you want to go for a couple of Kriegs, 2 or 3 Kriegs, or AKs depending, but especially if you have Krieg players, the Krieg is an incredibly dangerous gun, especially on second round, because you absolutely outclass anyone that has a UMP or an MP5 or MP7 or a FAMAS. The M4 can certainly do something against a Krieg, but those weaker guns that can oftentimes deal with especially SMG buys or pistol buys, have a very tough time at range, the type of range you can utilize with a Krieg, and the Krieg will absolutely decimate them. The AK can do something similar, but again, the range is not quite the same as the Krieg, and so you can't force them into situations where they feel extremely uncomfortable, only situations where they might feel just a tad uncomfortable, right? So I would highly recommend that if you have players that are willing to sacrifice for the team and potentially drop over a Krieg and only end up using a pistol for themselves. It's just incredibly strong. And this is the one thing I really wanted to highlight in the video. This is a ridiculously strong force buy that you need to not only be looking at using on your own T side, but also look at potentially strategizing against, especially if you're playing against teams that use this one. Now, the final thing to talk about here is the CT side second round force buy, and this is something I want to talk about more in terms of when you should be going for it, and specifically, I think this is pretty map dependent. I think the map that you're playing almost entirely dictates whether or not you want to be going for a second round force, and it's something that I want to highlight that people should be going for and suggesting their team go for more in matchmaking. I've noticed that in matchmaking and even in fairly high level pugs, people have a tendency to just save on second round, or one or two people force, and then you're in this awkward situation heading into third round where your team can't really buy, but you actually didn't force. I would highly recommend teams or players suggest that to their team more often on specific maps. And the maps that I'm thinking of are maps where utility is incredibly important, maps where ops are incredibly important, or maps where you feel like you have a very strong advantage by being on CT side. So what maps am I thinking about? Well, Overpass and Dust 2 are two of them where ops are incredibly important. I think these are maps where the force buy can really depend on how comfortable you feel. In matchmaking, you may not be looking at a force buy on Dust 2 because your CT side force buy feels a little bit weak. The terrorist side with Kriegs feels like they can shut you down at those long ranges, but Overpass, you might be thinking of utilizing force buys a little bit more because you have ops are incredibly important on CT side Overpass, and you combine that with CT side Overpass being fairly CT favored, you can force a lot of close range angles, and you can see it as a potential positive. Inferno is a map where I think second round forces have become 100% standard, and you can pretty much tell exactly why. Utility is ridiculously important on second round, or on Inferno in general, and your ability to buy utility is pretty heavily hampered when you go for that normal third round force buy. When you bought, maybe P250s on the second round. You're not going to be able to have full utility, and if your opponents do buy at full utility, sometimes it feels like they can kind of manhandle you. You combine that with the fact that CT side Inferno is very easy to force close range engagements where you make players uncomfortable with head armor, and on second round you can get a lot of utility with your force buy. You can see why second round forces on Inferno, in my opinion, should be 100% standard. Maybe if you're playing on a professional team where you might get somehow countered by going for a force buy with 100% consistency, things get a little bit wonky. But if you're looking at matchmaking or you're looking at a lower level team, I certainly recommend almost universally force buying on second round Inferno. Nuke is a map where I think that the CTs have sufficient advantage to go for a force buy, even though the other factors may not entirely be true, but they are to a certain extent. Of course, outer is very hard to deal with, and in my opinion, outer is a spot that is completely destroyed by how blatantly overpowered the Krieg is, but I think it's a map where you can certainly have so many close range angles, so many off angles, so many weird wonky spots you can play that not going for a force buy on second round Nuke is almost doing yourself a disservice, even if you don't think that the op heavy play or the utility heavy play is necessarily a factor in this buy. Now, what do you want to buy? Really depends on you as a player, depends on what you want to be going for, and it depends on a lot of other factors, so I can't really heavily recommend something to buy, but I can recommend the situations to do it in. So anyways, thanks for watching, and I hope this helped. Oh, shit. So I see you've been party to a sponsored video. And my sponsors are the most important thing to me. Now I want you to realize that I am fully behind the product and or service that is being offered by this sponsored ad. If you would like to become a sponsor for VooCSGO products and videos in the future, check out my Patreon, patreon.com/VooCSGO. They call me a sellout. They call me a sellout. I can't believe it. They call me a sellout. Oh,